Before we begin today's story, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy emotionally driven stories that linger with you long after the video ends. These are the kinds of stories that aren't loud or rushed, they settle quietly into your heart. And if you stay until the end, you may find yourself thinking about this one longer than you expect. My name is Lorraine Hayes, and for most of my life, I believed silence was peaceful. It wasn't until the house grew too quiet that I realized silence can also be heavy. The morning it happened, or almost happened, began like any other. I stood on the front porch of my home just outside Savannah, watching the sky hover in that strange space between night and morning. The air carried a damp stillness, and the coffee in my hands had already gone cold. At 60, I had grown used to mornings alone. 2 years earlier, my marriage had ended not with shouting or betrayal, but with a quiet sentence spoken across the kitchen table. I don't think I want this anymore. After 34 years together, my husband walked away without drama, just certainty. People assume quiet endings hurt less. They don't. They echo. I had adjusted to solitude because I had no choice. But adjusting isn't the same as healing. A breeze moved through the trees, sharp enough to pull me from my thoughts. That was when I noticed someone standing at the end of the driveway. It was Mark, my daughter Julia's husband. He had just stepped out of his truck and froze when he saw me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkwardness that filled the space. It was recognition. The kind that arrives uninvited and leaves questions behind. "Morning," he said finally, his voice steady. "Good morning," I replied, forcing calm into mine. It should have been ordinary, but something about it wasn't. Mark was 35. Dependable. Kind. Thoughtful in the careful way of someone who thinks before he speaks. He and Julia had been together since college, back when love felt effortless and the future seemed generous. Lately, though, Julia had been calling me more often. Her voice tired. Her sentences unfinished. "He's not unhappy," she once said. "He's just not here anymore." I didn't press her. Mothers learn when silence protects and when it wounds. Mark cleared his throat. "Julia mentioned you might need help with a few things around the house." I hadn't mentioned anything to Julia, but I nodded anyway. It felt easier than asking why he was really there. "Come in," I said. That decision, small and ordinary, would replay in my mind many times afterward. Mark stayed only a few minutes that first morning. He walked through the kitchen, glanced at the sink, tightened something beneath it that didn't truly need tightening. We spoke politely, about the weather, about Julia's schedule, about small, harmless things that floated between us like protective barriers. When he left, the house didn't feel warmer. It felt aware. As if the walls had noticed something I was still trying to ignore. That evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. I wasn't searching for youth or beauty. I was searching for clarity. Why had that simple exchange unsettled me? The answer came quickly. Because it had been too easy. He returned the next afternoon. This time without calling ahead. I told myself families drop by unannounced. That it meant nothing. Still, I chose a long-sleeve dress before opening the door. A detail so small it embarrassed me. "Julia said your faucet might still be acting up," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Another harmless excuse. Another opportunity to step back. Instead, I stepped aside. We ended up at the kitchen table again, 2 cups of coffee between us that neither of us touched. The clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. I rearranged the sugar bowl. He studied his hands. "How are you really doing?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "I'm fine," I replied automatically. He didn't argue. But he didn't believe me either. "You've been quieter lately," he said. "That happens when life changes shape," I answered. He let out a slow breath. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a house that remembers me better than the people inside it." That surprised me. Not because it was inappropriate. It wasn't. But because it was honest. "Marriage can become unfamiliar," I said carefully. "Not broken. Just unrecognizable." Something shifted then. Not toward danger. Toward depth. We spoke about loneliness. The kind that exists even when you're not alone. About how easy it is to disappear inside roles. Wife, husband, mother, provider. About how you can wake up one morning and realize you've been performing your own life. Nothing improper was said. No lines were crossed. And yet, something had changed. When he stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. "I don't talk like this with many people," he said quietly. "You should," I replied. "It's healthy." He nodded. But the look in his eyes told me this wasn't about health. It was about connection. And connection, when misplaced, can be dangerous. After he left, I sat in the quiet living room and felt the weight of something forming. Not an action, not a decision, just a possibility. And sometimes, possibility is the most unsettling thing of all. Over the next few weeks, Mark's visits became more frequent. Always brief. Always polite. Always wrapped in some harmless explanation. A loose cabinet hinge, a flickering porch light, a question about a warranty. I told myself it was kindness. Family helping family. But honesty has a way of tapping at your shoulder when you're trying not to look at it. One afternoon, Julia called. Her voice sounded thinner than usual. "We've been distant," she admitted. "Not fighting. Just drifting." I listened carefully, offering comfort where I could. But something inside me tightened. Because I knew something she didn't. Not an action. Not a betrayal. Just an undercurrent. That evening, Mark came by again. Julia was out of town visiting a friend. He didn't pretend there was something broken this time. He simply stood on the porch and said, "I was in the area." That was the moment I understood we were standing at the edge of something. Not a scandal. A choice. We sat in the living room. Sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. Dust floated lazily in the air, suspended in gold. Everything felt strangely still. "I think I'm confused," he said finally. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them steady. "Confusion isn't uncommon," I replied softly. "But it isn't permission either." He looked at me then, truly looked at me. Not as his wife's mother. Not as someone older or wiser. Just as a woman sitting across from him. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said. The honesty in his voice was real. So was the vulnerability. "Then don't," I answered. The silence that followed wasn't charged. It was clarifying. There are moments in life when you realize that desire isn't the most powerful force in the room. Character is. He exhaled slowly, almost as if something inside him had been released. "I should go." "Yes," I said gently. "You should." He stood. Hesitated only once, then walked toward the door. The soft click as it closed behind him sounded louder than it should have. I didn't move for a long time. Because the truth is, nothing had happened. And yet everything had. That afternoon didn't become the beginning of something forbidden. It became the end of something unspoken. And sometimes, restraint is the quietest form of love. The days after that afternoon felt strangely lighter. Not joyful. Not triumphant. Just clear. Mark didn't come by again without reason. When he did stop by the following week to drop off something Julia had forgotten, he stayed near the doorway. Polite. Measured. Careful in a way that told me he understood what had almost unfolded between us. And more importantly, what hadn't. We spoke the way we were supposed to. About groceries. About schedules. About ordinary things that belong in ordinary conversations. And it was enough. Later that evening, I walked through the house slowly, noticing how different it felt. Not emptier. Not fuller. Just honest. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Loneliness can make you vulnerable in ways you don't recognize at first. It whispers that connection, any connection, is better than none. It tempts you to blur lines just to feel seen again. But being seen at the wrong cost is not the same as being valued. A few days later, Julia called again. Her voice sounded steadier. "We're starting counseling," she said. "I think we stopped listening to each other somewhere along the way." I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "That's brave," I told her. After we hung up, I stood by the living room window, watching the late afternoon sun stretch across the yard. I thought about that morning on the porch. About recognition. About possibility. About how easily a single decision can redirect the course of several lives. No one applauds restraint. No one celebrates the boundaries you honor in private. But I did. Because sometimes the most meaningful moments in our lives aren't defined by what we choose to begin. They're defined by what we refuse to continue. And in that quiet house just outside Savannah, silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like peace.